Welcome to the Morning Gym, the show that explores Scripture in order to exercise and strengthen our faith in Jesus Christ. The Morning Gym is brought to you by Growing in Messiah, equipping believers to live and defend their faith. And now, here's your host, Caleb Haig.
What is up, fam? I am going to do a little bit different video today. Today, we're going to talk about... Okay, so I suppose... I actually really like doing videos like this. I suppose I should give you a little background before we jump into this, because this is going to be a multi-parter. On my other podcast that I do with a co-host, somebody came into the chat room and started talking about the Hebrew Roots movement and said that we were heretics because some guy named Matt Powell had done a video on the Hebrew Roots movement and proved that we were heretics. Okay, so I've just heard passing things about Matt Powell, and I don't want to be disparaging to any brothers or sisters in the Lord, and so I'm not gonna try to critique Matt Powell's theology or anything like that. But he did do a video, and he falls into the fundamentalist Baptist camp, and we'll talk more about that in the video that I'm going to do that actually is going to look at pieces of this documentary. Basically, in this documentary, my picture is seen for approximately 3 seconds, no sound of me talking or anything like that, just a flash picture of me. Okay, so whether or not that warrants me making a response or not, I don't really know. But one of the things that this did was this kind of ignited a conversation on Twitter with some people on what exactly the Hebrew Roots movement is, and so on and so forth. Now, I do not claim to be part of the Hebrew Roots movement. One of the things that, and we'll get into my theology and why people associate me with the Hebrew Roots movement from time to time. I personally claim to be a non-denominational Christian. That's title. Non-denominational Christian is what I claim to be. I believe I am, I grew up in a non-denominational Christian church. I am helping pastor what I would call a non-denominational Christian church now in Tacoma, and so that's where I come from. With that said, I certainly have some beliefs that many people would say, I don't know if that would fall into that category. The main belief that I hold to is I hold to a seventh-day Sabbath, and we'll talk about that too as well. In fact, I'm going to write a post on Growing in Messiah on the seventh-day Sabbath and why I keep the seventh-day Sabbath and those kind of things. However, it should quickly be noted that I do not believe that holding to a seventh-day Sabbath or celebrating a seventh-day Sabbath automatically leads you to be in the Hebrew Roots movement. I reject that out of hand. So today what I actually want to do is I want to talk about Messianic Judaism. The reason I want to do that is because I work for Torah Resource. I think most of the people who follow Growing in Messiah know that I work for Torah Resource. Torah Resource is a Messianic company, and Torah Resource does hold to theology that many people would say, oh, that falls into Hebrew Roots theology. Okay, well, that's why I want to start by talking about Messianic Judaism. Now, we need to start this conversation with actually making a distinction. I want to be really careful about how I talk about these things. First of all, what I'm going to say is going to be some people within the different camps of different theology are going to say that doesn't represent me. That happens to me a lot. A lot of the time, people will lump me into a group of people, and I'll say I'm not part of that group, or I'll say that's not my theology, even though So I want to preface all of this by saying I'm sure there are plenty of people who claim to be Messianic Jews and or within Messianic Judaism, but will say, no, this video is not right. Okay, fair enough. You can leave your comments below and let me know how it's not right. That's fine. But what I want to do is I want to start to make some distinctions between how I personally see Messianic Judaism, Messianic Jews, Hebrew Roots movement, Torah observance and or Sabbath observance and those kind of things. And then finally, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to walk through this documentary. Now, the documentary is called Laying an Axe to the Hebrew Roots. It's actually called The Sacred Name. And there's been, I've watched most of this, and I'm going to continue to watch it and before I critique it. But there, yeah. It's interesting to see how this person in this group, whoever this, if it is a group, I think it's just a person that made this documentary. It's interesting to see how they actually classify the Hebrew Roots movement. And so we're going to look at all of this in the next couple of videos. Today, let's talk about Messianic Jews and Messianic Judaism. So first of all, we need to make the distinction between those two. And the reason why is because today within Christianity, and I'm going to use Christianity as a very, very broad term here, but within Christianity, you have people who claim to be Messianic Jews, however, hold to what I would consider some pretty standard theologies. Now, that too might not really be the greatest thing to say. Standard theology. I mean, is there anything that is standard theology within Christianity today? Maybe, but the ultimate point is you have people like Dr. Michael Brown, who is the radio host for the radio program Line of Fire. He is considered a Messianic Jew. And why is that? Well, it's because he's Jewish by blood, so ethnic background, and has accepted Christ. In fact, he grew up, Dr. Michael Brown grew up in a Jewish family, in a practicing Jewish family. He had a bar mitzvah, all that kind of stuff. Another person who would be considered a Messianic Jew would be someone like Sid Roth. Sid Roth is a word of faith teacher. There's huge theological problems that Sid Roth has. But back in the 70s, Sid Roth started a radio program, or I believe it was a TV program, and it actually associates him with Messianic Judaism. Now, the word Messianic is in it. So Sid Roth is considered a Messianic Jew. Why? Not because he holds to any of the tenets of what would be considered like Messianic Judaism, but rather because he's a Jew who came to Christ and converted to Christianity. So this would be a term, Messianic Jew, that is used by people within Christianity today to identify someone who is ethnically Jewish. Possibly, we could also say, and this is, I mean, I don't know if I would say this is across the board, but we could also say that possibly the people who are Messianic Jews began their life being brought up within Judaism and converted to Christianity at some point. So this is what I would class as Messianic Jews. Now, before we go on, I just want to say, Sid Roth, I already mentioned that he has some really, really heretical views. The Polite Leader did a great video called 10 Worst Word of Faith Teachers, and on his list, number 10 was Sid Roth. I've put a link in the description of this video to that video because I think it's worth seeing. If you like Sid Roth's teaching, then I would encourage you to go see that video because I think that there are some major issues there. And I don't want people to think that I'm promoting Sid Roth. I also disagree strongly with Dr. Michael Brown, although I would consider him an acquaintance. He and I talk on maybe once a year or so. We'll have an interaction. I see him at the Evangelical Theological Society. Dr. Brown actually holds to Arminian theology, which I do not. He also is part of the charismatic movement, which I am not. And so there's definitely some differences in our theology. However, with that said, I believe that Dr. Brown is a brother in the Lord, and yeah, I'm happy to be acquainted with him. Okay, with all of that said, now, so that over here is Messianic Jews, like what I would term as Messianic Jews. Okay, now with that said, what is Messianic Judaism? Now, this is something that's different, and the reason why is because Messianic Judaism is actually a movement, and there are theological attachments to Messianic Judaism. So, for instance, Messianic Judaism, everyone pretty much says that it began in the late 19th century, so the 1800s, and it comes out of people trying to reach the Jewish people. This is how it starts. It starts by evangelicals saying, how do we reach the Jewish people? And so initially, it's just kind of a missionary outreach to Jewish people. And one of the things that they decided to do was to have Messianic Jews worship in the traditional synagogue format. And basically what they do is they take the synagogue liturgy, they take the, they start worshiping like the synagogues on Saturday, except for they incorporate Jesus into the worship, the synagogue worship. And this is somewhat alluring to people, but not predominantly to Jews. And we'll talk about that more as we get into the later formation of the Hebrew Roots movement. But if you go look at like the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, which is the MJAA, or the UMJC, which is the United Messianic Jewish Congregations, both of those sites, which I would say are the two powerhouse Messianic Jewish organizations in the world today, both of them have a history. And I've put those both, like one is the Messianic Jewish Movement. That's on like MJAA, the Messianic movement. That's the history according to the MJAA. The UMJC has a history as well. And they say that they actually come out of another group, which is called the International Messianic Jewish Alliance. The International Messianic Jewish Alliance starts in 1925. So the group itself is fairly new. It's a new, I want to say, movement. And really, it's an outreach that becomes a movement. And so basically what happens is the outreach to the Jews is kind of seen as, we're going to worship in the way that the synagogue worships, and maybe this will bring Jews in that will feel comfortable, and then they will see Christ. Okay, so with that said, what is the Messianic movement today? Like, what has it become? And you can, with the links in the description, you can go and kind of see the history of all this kind of stuff. Well, basically what happens is you have Jews who say, you know what? We believe that the Torah gives us identity. Now, before everyone freaks out, I'm going to hash this out a little bit right now. What that means for many of these Messianic Jews is that the Torah itself, the laws within the Torah, are not necessarily needed for any other reason other than to give Jews identity. Now, this is held by people such as Dan Juster, Russ Resnick. Basically, it's a major theological belief of the MJAA. And so what they believe is, I'm Jewish by blood, and I want to retain my culture and my history. And I think that my culture and my history comes from a long line of, faith in the God of Israel, just as Christianity. And therefore, I want to hold on to this. I want to observe these things, not because it brings me salvation, not because anything else, except for it gives me a identity marker within my people. Okay. Now, some people might say, no, that's not really what Messianic Judaism believes. However, if you read people who are championing the UMJC today, like Kinzer and Rudolph, this is exactly what they say. They say that the Jews should worship in a Jewish way, according to the Torah, and that the Gentiles should worship according to basically the church model, and that the two should be separate, but should love each other anyway. Okay. Well, with all of that said, you have another movement that starts to form within Messianic Judaism. And that is the view of someone like my father, Tim Hegg. Now, basically what happens is in the 80s, my father is, and one of the reasons that I'm bringing my father up is because he's actually championed a theology within Messianic Judaism. My father is researching his Jewish history and trying to find the relatives that he's lost in the Holocaust. And he starts to realize the joy of living a Jewish lifestyle as well. And that's more, at the time, back in the 80s, I think that was more just to try to do exactly what people like Juster and Resnick and Rudolph and Kinzer are doing, which is to try to attach himself to his history and to his lineage. And so as that progresses, my father starts to actually move his theology to a different form of theology. My father says, okay, well, I think that the Torah itself is actually God's way of sanctifying, not justifying, but sanctifying Israel. And now all of a sudden, the question that starts to become prevalent in my father's mind is one that has been debated by Jews and Gentiles alike since time began, which is, who is Israel and what is a Jew? And so because of this, my father starts to believe in what is now termed as one law theology, or one Torah for all is another term that people will use. Another term is one Torah theology. Now, this was actually upheld by a Messianic group called First Fruits of Zion for a long time. Back in the around 2008, 2009, FFOZ, First Fruits of Zion, actually started to shift their view to a more standard Messianic Jewish theology. Now, one of the reasons that my father's company, Torah Resource, is considered, I would think it's considered a Messianic company, is because, well, I think my father would actually disagree with this, but my father's a Messianic Jew. And so therefore, and there's a lot of there's not a lot of things that are placed within ethnicity within the Messianic Jewish view. Now, that wouldn't be the case for my father, but for other people within the MJAA, within the UMJC, within the the International Messianic Jewish Alliance, all of these groups really place this huge emphasis on ethnicity. Okay, so my father comes to start believing in what is called one law theology. And this is where a lot of people are going to say, aha, you're part of the Hebrew roots movement, at least when they're pointing to my father. Let's read what, now, I know Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not normally a place I go to. However, whoever wrote this little snippet on one law theology within Messianic Judaism actually has some interesting things to say about it, because they don't really talk about the theology so much as they lay out kind of different people's positions on it. So normally I wouldn't use this as anything. I don't think this is like a reliable source, but at the same time, I think what is said here is interesting. So on the Messianic Judaism Wikipedia page, it says one law theology. One law theology, aka one Torah for all, teaches that anyone who is a part of Israel is obligated to observe the covenant and its provisions as outlined in the Torah. Dan Juster of Tikkun and Russ Resnick of the UMJC have argued against the one law movement's insistence on Gentiles being required to observe the entirety of Torah in the same way as Jews. Tim Hegg responded to their article defending what he believes to be the biblical teaching of one law theology and its implications concerning the obligations of Torah obedience by new Messianic believers from the nations. The Coalition of Torah Observant Messianic Congregations, which is the CTOMC, likewise rejects bilateral ecclesiology. This is a really big word, and if you're confused by that, basically this is something that Dr. Kinzer has pushed really, really hard. Bilateral ecclesiology is the idea that God has one ecclesia, one family, one church, if you want to say it. But basically, Kinzer says it's like a duplex. The Jews are on the top level, the Gentiles are on the bottom level. They're all in the same house, but never the two shall meet, kind of a thing. So basically, this snippet out on Wikipedia says the Coalition of Torah Observant Messianic Congregations likewise rejects bilateral ecclesiology in favor of the one Torah for all, or one law position. Okay, so basically they hash this, whoever wrote this hashes this out somewhat well, in that they say that those who hold to one law or one Torah theology believe that Israel is sanctified to God. Once a person is justified, Israel as a nation and Israel as a people group is sanctified unto God through Torah. Now, what one Torah theology has done, they've said, okay, well, who is Israel? Israel is anyone who comes into covenant relationship with God. And that means not just covenant relationship through eighth-day circumcision, but it means any covenant, i.e. Mosaic covenant. That would be like birthright covenantal inclusion, such as someone being born into a Jewish family and being circumcised on the eighth day. So this would be like more temporal covenant, or new covenant, which would mean any person from any nation who comes to faith in Jesus Christ is now coming into covenant relationship, and therefore the covenant obligations are there. And we're going to get into the idea of required or not, because this is actually one of the big sticking points that this documentary, Laying the Axe of the Hebrew Roots Movement, actually brings up. They're going to say within their documentary, oh, well, people within the Hebrew Roots Movement, and we haven't talked about the Hebrew Roots Movement yet, and we'll do that in the next video, or in one of the videos, but they're going to say, oh, well, the Hebrew Roots Movement often says you're justified by faith. However, it's a works plus faith model. And I actually have seen a lot of this in the Hebrew Roots Movement too. So but the Fundamentalist Baptists have a very interesting view of sanctification. So we're going to talk about all that. We're going to hash it out. For now, what I'm trying to show you is what I would consider the Messianic movement, which predominantly, I would say, is pushed forward by, at least within the International Messianic Jewish Alliance, the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, and the United Messianic Jewish Congregations. Those three main organizations are going to say that ethnicity is a huge part of Messianic Judaism. In other words, Messianic Jews are the ones who are pushing Messianic Judaism. Someone like my father, Tim Hegg, is going to say, no, Messianic Judaism is for anyone who is a covenant member, and that would include anyone who has faith in Jesus Christ. Okay, so now people are going to say, well, that's crossing over into Hebrew Roots Movement. Okay, the fact that my father is in fact Jewish and that his mother was Jewish, according to the UMJC, according to the MJAA, my father is Jewish and therefore is a Messianic Jew, and therefore his organization, according to them, I think would fall under Messianic Judaism. So I hope that has given you some kind of a understanding of at least how I see Messianic Judaism and Messianic Jews within the world today. Now, I think on the next video that I will do, we're going to talk about the Hebrew Roots Movement. We're going to talk about ethnicity and whether or not Judaism matters, all those kind of things. And we're going to then look at this documentary. At some point, we're going to get to this documentary, and this is actually what I'm really looking forward to, because I think that it's fun to kind of, I don't want to put anyone down, any brother or sister down in the Lord. And, there's also been some really good videos that, well, I don't know, classify really good. I mean, I think there has been some misinformation on the Hebrew Roots Movement. And I think that the Hebrew Roots Movement itself is used as a blanket statement for just a swath of theologies. And I don't think that it's fair to put a lot of people into the Hebrew Roots Movement that have been placed into the Hebrew Roots Movement. So we'll talk about all of that at some point soon. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time here on The Morning Gym.